The alien princess challenged a human. She didn't know his true power. The moment I walked into the Galactic Conclave chamber, every eye in the room found me and then immediately looked away. That was worse than being stared at. I was carrying a titanium briefcase, a thermos of black coffee, and a folder of documents that most of the species in this room didn't even know existed. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 41 years old, a former battlefield medic from New Zealand, and the sole human representative at the most important diplomatic gathering in the known galaxy. No escort, no fleet waiting outside, no weapons. Just me, my coffee, and 3 years of reading every treaty, clause, and legal footnote ever filed with the Galactic Conclave. The chamber was enormous. It had been carved into a neutral asteroid between 3 star systems, and the walls curved inward like the inside of a shell. Hundreds of delegations filled the tiered seats, each one representing a civilization that had been among the stars for anywhere between 200 and 8,000 years. The lighting shifted to match whatever spectrum a species found comfortable. Near the upper left, the Korathi delegation sat in near darkness. Closer to the floor, the saloon drifted in liquid-filled pressure suits that hissed softly when they moved. And at the center, directly across from the single human standard chair that had been placed almost as an afterthought near the lower tier, sat the Ithrani delegation. I had studied the Ithrani for the entire year before this summit. They were tall, broad through the shoulders, with a second pair of arms that were slightly shorter than the first and used almost exclusively for formal gestures. Their skin shifted color with their mood, the way a human's face might flush or pale. The Ithrani Empire was the second largest in the conclave by territory, and the largest by military strength. They had never lost a formal engagement in recorded history. Their princess was named Valeth. She was the youngest member of the Ithrani royal line ever to lead a diplomatic mission, and from everything I had read, she had earned the position by being better at nearly everything than anyone around her. The Ithrani delegation sat in a raised section slightly above the general floor level, not because the room was designed that way, but because they had simply brought their own elevated platform and installed it without asking anyone. Valeth noticed me when I sat down. I know because her skin shifted briefly from its usual deep blue-gray to a pale silver, which according to my research indicated surprise. Then it shifted back. Then she turned away. That was fine. I had expected that. The session opened with the standard proceedings. Trade agreements between the Korathi and the Pelvani, a border dispute between 2 minor systems in the outer rim, resource rights near a dying star that 3 different civilizations claimed for 3 different reasons. I listened to all of it. I took notes in a small paper notebook because my hands needed something to do, and because paper, unlike an electronic device, never ran out of battery at a critical moment. When the session reached new membership applications, my name was listed last. Earth, represented by Marcus Hale, application for full voting membership in the Galactic Conclave. The chamber coordinator read it out in a tone that suggested he had already decided the answer. I stood up. The room didn't exactly go quiet because many of the species present communicated on frequencies humans couldn't hear, but the visible reactions shifted. Heads turned. The liquid in the saloon's suits sloshed as they repositioned. I stated Earth's case clearly. We had met every criterion listed in Article 7 of the Conclave Charter: population threshold, verified independent government, demonstrated capacity for interstellar travel, active diplomatic relations with at least 3 conclave members. I cited the exact clause numbers. I cited the dates of compliance. I had the documentation. Valeth spoke before I had even finished. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The Ithrani language carries weight through pitch and resonance, and even through the translation implant behind my ear, the dismissal in her tone was perfectly clear. Earth is a registered primitive world, she said. It has been so for 112 years. The designation grants the planet protection status, not membership eligibility. The human before us has either misread the charter or is presenting a misunderstanding as fact. A few delegations made sounds that translated as polite agreement. I did not sit down. I opened my folder. I found the page I had marked 8 months ago during my second complete read of the Conclave's legal archive. I read the relevant passage aloud. Article 7, Subsection 4, Clause 9. A protected designation applied under emergency first contact protocols expires automatically upon the subject civilization demonstrating all standard membership criteria, regardless of the duration of the protection period. Expiration of the designation does not require a formal vote. It is self-executing upon verified compliance. The chamber was genuinely quiet now, even on the frequencies I couldn't hear. Valeth's skin had shifted to silver again. I continued. Earth had met each criterion. I had the verification dates. The protection designation had, under the exact language of the document that the Ithrani Empire itself had signed 112 years ago, already expired. Earth was not applying for membership. Earth was informing the Conclave that it was already a member and requesting its voting seat. Valeth stood up. She was nearly a full meter taller than me. Her second pair of arms moved in a gesture that my research told me was reserved for formal challenges. Her skin had shifted to a deep, burning amber. "You are a medic from a world that has had faster-than-light travel for 11 years, she said. You cite documents you could not possibly understand the full implications of. You stand in this chamber without rank, without a fleet, without a single ally formally recorded in this session, and you claim a seat that has never been held by your kind." "Yes," I said. "Then let it be settled by the trial of measure," she said. The room erupted in noise across every frequency. The trial of measure was an ancient conclave tradition, older than most of the current member civilizations. When a formal challenge to membership or authority could not be resolved by documentation alone, any party could invoke it. The challenged party faced 3 tests chosen by the challenger. Winning all 3 confirmed the claim. Losing even one meant the matter was closed permanently in the challenger's favor. If I lost, Earth would be formally classified as a ward of the Ithrani Empire. 8 billion people, ward status, no vote, no voice, no recourse. I looked at Valeth across the chamber floor. Her amber skin was steady, not flickering. She was confident, completely, entirely confident. I thought about the folder in my hands. I thought about the 3 years I had spent reading every document this conclave had ever produced. I thought about the 11 months I had spent specifically preparing for the possibility that someone would challenge me. The moment I cited that clause, because I had known, from the first time I read it, that citing it would make someone angry. I had prepared for angry. "I accept," I said. Valeth smiled. I had read about Ithrani smiles. They were not the same as human smiles. They did not mean happiness. They meant certainty. I sat back down and poured a cup of coffee from my thermos, because the first test would not begin until the following morning, and I had a night of reviewing notes ahead of me. The conclave's xenobiologist, a 4-armed being named Coordinator Peth, drifted past my chair about an hour into the evening session and paused long enough to look at me with something that seemed, through the translation of alien body language, like concern. "You understand what you have agreed to," Coordinator Peth said. It was not quite a question. "I do," I said. "The Ithrani princess has never lost a trial of measure," Peth said. "I know," I said. "Does she know that the last species to lose one to her went extinct 40 years later from a combination of economic collapse and forced dependency on Ithrani trade routes?" Coordinator Peth was very still for a moment. "That is not a proven causation," Peth said carefully. "No," I agreed, "it isn't." Peth left without another word. I watched Valith across the chamber. She was speaking quietly with her advisors, and her skin was a calm, steady blue-gray again. I finished my coffee. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote 3 words at the top. She doesn't know. Then I started writing what I did know, and what I planned to do with it. And by the time the chamber lights dimmed for the night cycle, I had filled 11 pages and was reaching for my second cup. The gravitational immersion chamber was located in a lower section of the asteroid station, in a reinforced bay that smelled of metal and recycled air. It was a sphere about 8 meters across, made of a dark alloy that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. At its center, suspended on a platform that could be raised and lowered remotely, were 2 chairs. The gravity inside could be adjusted from 0 to 12 times standard galactic reference, which itself was calibrated to Ithrani homeworld gravity. Ithrani homeworld gravity was approximately 1.3 times Earth standard. This was a fact that I had written down in my notebook the first week I began preparing for this assignment, because it was the kind of fact that seemed small and turned out to matter enormously. Valith chose the first test herself, as was her right under the trial of measure rules. She announced it to the full conclave assembly that morning with a calm that bordered on theatrical. Gravitational immersion. Both contestants would enter the chamber. Gravity would begin at standard and increase incrementally every 15 minutes. The last contestant to remain conscious and upright would win the test. The upper limit Valith had selected was 4 times Ithrani standard. She had specified this the night before, and I had heard the number and done the arithmetic in my head while she was still speaking. 4 times Ithrani standard. Ithrani standard was 1.3 times Earth standard. That meant the upper limit of this chamber was 5.2 times Earth standard gravity. I had worked in a rotating field hospital near Jupiter's gravity assist corridor for 3 years. The hospital itself operated at 1.6 Earth standard to keep fluid from pooling in low-gravity patients recovering from deep space surgery. The training rotations near the corridor ran higher, sometimes much higher, depending on the trajectory window. We wore weighted suits on top of that during active shifts, because the chief medical officer believed that if you could work in high gravity while exhausted, you could work anywhere. I had hated Chief Medical Officer Dr. Carroll at the time. I thought about her now with considerable gratitude. The chamber preparation took about an hour. Medical staff from 4 different species monitored the setup. Valith's personal physician ran a full biometric scan of both of us before we entered. When he reached me, he paused over his scanner twice. "Your cardiovascular density is unusual," he said, through the translation implant. "I exercise," I said. He looked at me in a way that suggested he did not find this a satisfying explanation. We entered the chamber at mid-morning. The assembly watched through a transparent panel set into the chamber wall, high enough that it caught the overhead lighting like a window. I could see several hundred faces, or what served as faces, pressed toward the glass. I could see Coordinator Peth standing to one side with a datapad. I could see Valith's advisors in a cluster, their skin tones a collective calm. Valith and I sat in the 2 chairs on the platform. The platform rose to the center of the sphere. The door sealed. The gravity clicked on. Standard Ithrani reference felt like standing on Earth at sea level, only slightly heavier. Unremarkable. Valith sat straight in her chair, both sets of arms resting on the armrests, her breathing measured and slow. She had clearly done this before. She was training for this, probably for her entire adult life. I opened my thermos and poured a cup of coffee. Valith watched me do this. Her skin shifted a fraction toward silver. She said nothing. The first increment hit at 15 minutes. The gravity jumped from 1 to 1.5 Ithrani standard. I felt my body settle deeper into the chair. My shoulders got heavier. I straightened my spine because slouching under high gravity is a good way to compress the vertebrae into places they don't enjoy. Valith didn't move at all. I had the impression she could have been sitting on her own front porch. I drank my coffee. The second increment came. 2 times Ithrani standard. 2.6 times Earth standard. It wasn't comfortable. There is no honest way to describe high-gravity exposure as comfortable. Your blood wants to go to your legs. Your heart has to work harder to push it upward. Your breathing becomes a more deliberate act because the chest wall gets heavier and the lungs have to push against it. It's the kind of physical sensation that makes most people's brains start suggesting, very politely, that perhaps lying down would be preferable. I had spent 3 years learning to disagree with that suggestion. I thought about a specific afternoon in the field hospital, the one where a cargo freighter pilot had come in with internal injuries from a collision near the corridor. The surgery had run 6 hours. The gravity in the surgical bay had been held at 1.8 Earth standard during that window because lowering it would have affected the patient's fluid pressure in ways that complicated the repair. 6 hours, standing, working with instruments, making decisions. Next to that afternoon, this was a chair. The third increment, 2.5 Ithrani standard, 3.25 Earth standard. Valith's breathing changed, not dramatically. It wouldn't for her, but it deepened slightly, became more deliberate. Her skin remained calm blue-gray, but the color was a touch darker than before. Her second arms moved off the armrests and braced against her thighs. I noticed that the assembled observers outside the glass had stopped talking. Coordinator Peth had put down the datapad. The fourth increment, 3 times Ithrani standard, 3.9 Earth standard. This one landed with weight. I felt it in my jaw and my wrists, in the effort it took to keep my neck straight. The coffee in my thermos felt like it weighed as much as a textbook. I poured more anyway because the act of pouring it, of keeping my hand steady, of doing something deliberate and ordinary in extraordinary conditions, was itself a technique. It kept the mind present. It told the body that we were not in crisis. We were just doing something routine that happened to require more effort than usual. I had learned this from a trauma surgeon who had spent years working in exactly the kind of high-gravity, high-chaos environments I had been trained for. She called it anchoring behavior. Pick something simple and do it with intention. Do not let the environment convince you that everything has changed, because most things haven't. Valith was looking at me. I wasn't sure when she had started, but she was watching me pour coffee with an expression that I could not read from her skin tone alone. It wasn't contempt anymore. Contempt had a specific color, according to my research. This was something else, something closer to the way you look at a door you were sure you had locked when you come home and find it slightly open. The fifth increment, 3.5 Ithrani standard. The medics outside the glass were now in active communication with each other. I could see them speaking rapidly. One of them was pointing at what I assumed was a biometric readout. Valith made a sound. Low, controlled. She straightened in her chair and brought both sets of hands flat against the armrests. It was a recovery movement, the kind of thing trained bodies do automatically when they feel themselves beginning to drift toward the edge. She recovered fully. She was extraordinary. I want to be honest about that because this is not a story about Valith failing. Valith was the finest specimen of a species specifically evolved for dense gravity environments, trained from childhood in physical and mental endurance, and she sat in that chair with her spine straight and her breathing steady at 3.5 Ithrani standard gravity, and she did not yield. But she had made the sound, and I had heard it. The sixth increment, 4 times Ithrani standard, 5.2 times Earth standard. This was the declared upper limit, the maximum, the gravity that no species in the conclave's recorded history had described as sustainable beyond the short term. I put down my cup. I pressed my feet flat against the floor of the platform, feeling the magnetic lock in my boot soles engage automatically, a feature of the standard diplomatic footwear that I had specifically requested before departing Earth because I had read the chamber specs 3 months ago and packed accordingly. Then I sat still. I thought about Earth, not abstractly, specifically. I thought about Christchurch in the early morning before a long run, when the air smells like rain on grass and the city is still quiet. I thought about what it felt like to finish a 15-kilometer run and sit on a bench and drink cold water and feel the particular satisfaction of having asked something hard of your body and received an answer. I thought about why I was here, not in this chamber, here, at this summit, in this asteroid, representing 8 billion people who were going about their lives right now not knowing that someone was sitting in a sphere with the gravity of a gas giant pressing down on his shoulders and thinking about them. That mattered. It mattered more than the gravity. Valeth swayed. It was very slight, less than an inch, but I saw it and so did the observers outside the glass, because the communication among the medical staff outside suddenly increased sharply. She caught herself. She braced. Her second arms gripped the armrests with visible force. Her skin had gone dark, a very deep blue, which according to my notes indicated extreme concentration and physical stress being managed by conscious will. She was not going to give up easily. I had known that. I hadn't expected easy. I reached for my thermos again. It was nearly empty. I poured the last of it into my cup, which felt like lifting a moderate-weight dumbbell at this gravity level. I drank it slowly. Valeth watched me. I watched her. 7 minutes and 40 seconds after the final increment hit, Valeth's body made the decision that her mind was still arguing against. The signal from her inner ear overruled her training. Her vision, almost certainly, went gray at the edges the way high-G vision loss always does. She slumped. Not a collapse, not a fall. Her medical team had the door open and were inside within seconds, and she was conscious, oriented, and speaking to them before they reached her chair. She had not passed out. She had simply reached the absolute edge of biological capacity, and her body had chosen, correctly, not to go past it. The chamber gravity dropped to standard immediately. I sat in my chair. The medical team looked at me. I looked back at them. "I'm fine," I said, though I wouldn't say no to a refill if anyone has a thermos on them. Nobody had a thermos. The observers outside the glass were very quiet. Coordinator Peth had retrieved the datapad but was not looking at it. The datapad was held loosely at the coordinator's side, while Peth stared at me with an expression that I had no cultural reference for at all. Valeth from her chair said something to her physician. The physician consulted a screen. Valeth said something else. The physician nodded. Then Valeth looked at me. Her skin had shifted. It was not the silver of surprise from yesterday. It was not the amber of formal challenge. It was something I had to look up later that evening because I hadn't seen it in any of my preparation materials. It was a pale, pale green. I found the reference at about midnight, during my notes review before sleep. Pale green in Ithrani skin tone language meant recalibration. It was the color they turned when their fundamental assumptions about something were being quietly, irreversibly revised. Valeth declared the result a coincidence of biology the next morning, formally, in front of the full assembly. Nobody in the room looked entirely convinced, including Valeth. The War of Thought was considered the most prestigious test in the entire trial of measure tradition. It had been developed by the Ithrani Military Academy 1400 years ago as a training tool for high command officers, and the Galactic Conclave had adopted it as a formal assessment mechanism roughly 600 years later. It ran on a dedicated simulation system built into the Conclave station's core, and it had never been defeated on its hardest setting in the 200 years since the hardest setting was added. The hardest setting was called the Siege of Keth. Keth was a real historical battle. 1400 years ago, during the Ithrani Empire's early expansion period, a rival civilization had fortified a star system at a critical navigational junction and held it against an Ithrani advance force for 3 years. The Ithrani had ultimately taken the system, but at enormous cost, and the commander who finally broke through had been celebrated as a tactical genius for generations afterward. In the simulation, you played the defenders. The defending side had never won. This was not a secret. It was stated plainly in the simulation's documentation. The Siege of Keth was used specifically because it was considered a near-perfect illustration of the limits of defensive strategy against a superior force. Ithrani commanders trained on it to learn how to apply overwhelming pressure. They did not train on it expecting the other side to succeed, because the other side could not succeed. This was the framework Valith selected for the second test. She announced it without theatrics. She simply stood before the conclave, stated the test and its parameters, and sat back down. I noticed that her skin remained exactly blue-gray throughout. She had controlled whatever she had felt during the gravitational chamber and replaced it with professional composure. I respected that. Then I opened my notebook to the section I had labeled Pre-Summit Reading List, found the entry from my 3rd month of preparation, and confirmed what I had written there. A brief summary of an ancient Earth military engagement, the Battle of Cannae, 216 before the Common Era, Carthaginian General Hannibal Barca commanding. I had read it originally because one of Earth's early xenomilitary scholars had argued that the Galactic Conclave's war simulation systems were modeled on engagement types that occurred repeatedly across all intelligent species histories, and that Earth's own extensive record of military history was therefore more relevant to galactic contexts than most people assumed. I had found the argument persuasive. I spent the night before the second test reviewing, not the Siege of Keth specifically, because I had read everything available about it 6 months earlier, and rereading it would not change what I knew. Instead, I reviewed the underlying logic of the engagement, the resource lines, the supply structure of the Ithrani advance force as historically documented, the ratio of attacker to defender, the terrain of the simulation's navigational map. I was looking for a specific kind of problem, a resource dependency that the original defenders had not exploited, and that the simulation's designers had not patched, because no one who had ever run it had come from a military tradition that treated supply line disruption as a primary rather than secondary tactic. The Ithrani doctrine, as I understood it from their published military philosophy texts, treated attrition warfare as dishonorable. You engaged the enemy directly. You overwhelmed through strength, speed, and coordination. You did not starve an opponent. You did not wait. Waiting was a sign of insufficient force. This was a coherent philosophy. It had worked extremely well for 1400 years. It had one structural weakness. It had never been seriously tested by an opponent who did not share it. The simulation chamber was smaller than the gravitational sphere, but more complex. It looked like a standard command room, with a central display surface that projected the engagement map in 3 dimensions, surrounded by input stations and a coordinator's terminal. Valith and I were separated into adjacent but isolated rooms. We would each run our respective sides without knowing the other's specific decisions until those decisions resolved on the shared map. A senior conclave official explained the rules to both of us via a communication link. There were very few rules. You played your side. The simulation ran on its internal logic. The test ended when one side achieved decisive victory, defined as either the attacker reaching the central system or the defender forcing the attacker to withdraw. The simulation had never, in 200 years, ended with a defender victory. I looked at the 3-dimensional map, for about 40 minutes before I made my first move. The Ithrani advance force in the simulation was large, historically accurate to the original battle, which meant it was formidable in direct engagement. It had superior numbers, superior individual unit strength, and a battle doctrine designed around fast, decisive confrontation. It also had supply lines. The simulation's supply lines extended back through 3 navigational waypoints, each of which represented a logistics hub that fed the advance force with energy, equipment, and materiel. The original defenders had not touched those waypoints. They had not touched them because the historical defenders were a civilization with a warrior culture that considered attacking supply convoys beneath their military code. I was a medic from Earth. I did not have a military code. I had something better. I had 3,000 years of recorded human conflict, from ancient river valleys to the asteroid belts of the outer solar system, and somewhere in that record was every variation of every strategic problem that any mind had ever faced in the context of organized confrontation. I had read a significant portion of it, not because I had expected to use it in exactly this way, but because I had spent 11 months trying to understand everything I could about how minds solved hard problems under pressure, and military history was one of the densest available archives of exactly that. I sent my first units not toward the Ithrani advance force. I sent them toward the rearmost supply waypoint. I did this quietly. I used the smallest, fastest units available to the defender, the ones historically used for reconnaissance rather than engagement, because they were not expected to fight and therefore not watched carefully. I sent them on a route that skirted the edge of the engagement map, through 2 sectors that the simulation had classified as low strategic value because there was nothing there worth protecting. There wasn't anything there worth protecting. There was, however, a navigational corridor that connected to the 3rd supply waypoint without passing through any contested space. It took 4 simulation hours for my units to reach the 3rd waypoint. During those 4 hours, Valeth's advance force engaged my main defensive line 3 times, each time with increasing coordination. She was brilliant at this, genuinely brilliant. Her units moved with a precision that looked almost choreographed. She found weaknesses in my line the way water finds gaps in stone, and she was patient about it, which surprised me, because patience was not typically cited as an Ithrani military virtue. I yielded ground when she pressed. I did not yield it the way a crumbling defense yields ground. I yielded it the way a tide pulls back before a wave. I maintained enough resistance to make each advance cost her something, then contracted my line slightly and held. She was spending resources, not quickly, but steadily. When my units reached the 3rd supply waypoint, I took it. The simulation registered the loss immediately. The advance force's energy reserves began declining, slowly at first because a force that size has buffers, but declining. I sent a second group of units toward the 2nd waypoint. This group was slightly larger because the 2nd waypoint was better monitored than the 3rd. I lost half of them getting there. The ones that arrived were enough. The advance force's reserves declined faster. Valeth redirected part of her force to recover the waypoints. I had expected this. The units she redirected were drawn from her flanking elements, which weakened her pressure on my main defensive line. I tightened the line, made it cheaper to hold, and let her spend the redirected units on trying to recapture supply points that I had already partially dismantled. She recaptured the 3rd waypoint. By the time she did, her overall reserves had dropped by 22%. She sent a dedicated recovery force to the 2nd waypoint. They arrived and found my units already gone, having completed the dismantling and withdrawn along the same edge corridor they had used coming in. I was now sending a 3rd group toward the 1st waypoint. This one was a feint. It was never going to reach the 1st waypoint. It was going to be visible on the simulation's tracking system, draw the advance force's attention to the northwest of the engagement map, and occupy Valeth's tactical thinking while I did something else. The something else was Hannibal. The Battle of Cannae, 216 before the Common Era. Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca faced a Roman army that outnumbered his force and had the advantage of disciplined infantry in a direct confrontation. He placed his weakest troops at the center of his line, exactly where the Romans would expect to push through and win, and his strongest cavalry units on both flanks. The Roman center pushed forward against Hannibal's weak center, which deliberately gave ground rather than breaking. This pulled the Roman force inward, into a narrowing space, exactly like a funnel, while the Carthaginian cavalry swept around both flanks and closed behind them. It remains, as of my last reading, one of the most studied single-day military engagements in human history. The Roman force lost somewhere between 50 and 70,000 soldiers. The Carthaginians lost a fraction of that number. I applied the logic to my defensive line at the 11-hour mark of the simulation. My center contracted, not a collapse, a deliberate measured withdrawal that created a concave shape in my line, open toward the advancing Ithrani force. It looked, on the engagement map, like exhaustion. It looked like my line was finally beginning to fail. Valeth drove into the concave center, exactly the way the Romans drove into Hannibal's. My flanking units, which I had been quietly rebuilding while the center absorbed pressure, moved outward and then curved inward behind the advancing Ithrani force. My rebuilt long-range assets, which I had kept off the primary map by staging them in the same low-value sectors I had used earlier, moved to seal the top of the gap. The simulation ran its resolution logic. The advance force was not surrounded. The Ithrani units were too well-trained and too mobile for a clean encirclement. But they were inside a pressure envelope, with their supply lines already weakened, their reserves down by 31%, and two flanks under sudden and unexpected engagement from directions they had not registered as active threats. The simulation projected forward 60 hours. At the 60-hour projection, the advance force's reserves would be exhausted. The simulation flagged the result. Defender victory. I leaned back in my chair. The chamber coordinator on the other side of the communication link was silent for a long moment. Then, please confirm. The simulation is showing a defender victory on the Siege of Keth scenario. This has not occurred in this system's operational history. I'm confirming, I said. More silence. Then Valeth's voice came through the shared channel, not her translator, her actual voice in Ithrani, which my implant rendered as a very precise, very controlled sentence. What are you? It was the second time something about me had made her shift from a script she had clearly written in advance. I thought about how to answer. I could have said, I'm the product of a species with 3,000 years of recorded warfare, more conflicts and more strategies and more catastrophic failures and hard-won lessons than most galactic civilizations have had time to accumulate. I could have said, I'm someone who spent 11 months in a small apartment reading military history instead of sleeping, because I knew that someone in that conclave chamber was going to challenge me, and I wanted to be ready for every version of what ready might mean. Instead, I said, I'm a medic from New Zealand. The channel was quiet again. When we reconvened in the main chamber, the conclave assembly was different from how it had been the previous day. I couldn't point to a specific thing. The seats were in the same positions. The lighting was the same. The delegations were the same delegations. But the quality of the attention in the room was different. Yesterday I had been an interesting problem, a paperwork anomaly with a thermos. Today I was something the room had not yet found the right category for. Coordinator Peth pulled up the Ithrani Empire's full biological and strategic registry on Earth before the afternoon session began. I happened to be walking past the coordinator's workstation when this happened. I saw the file load. I saw the original classification at the top. Primitive, protected, non-voting, restricted. I watched Peth begin to type an amendment into the classification field. Peth noticed me watching and stopped. "Carry on," I said. "I don't mind." Peth looked at me for a long moment with the same expression from the gravitational chamber, the one I still had no cultural reference for. "We didn't know," Peth said quietly. "No one knew. We have had Earth on file for 112 years, and none of the information in this registry suggested that you were." Peth stopped. "That we were what?" I asked. Peth looked back at the screen, at the original classification. "That you were anything like this," Peth said. Valith, across the chamber, was in close conversation with her senior advisor. Her skin was blue-gray, perfectly controlled, but her second hands, resting at her sides, were moving in a very small, very contained version of the gestures that my research had filed under. Internal processing of unexpected information. I went back to my seat. I opened my notebook. One test remained. I wrote its name at the top of the page and underlined it once. Then I sat with my empty thermos and thought about what was coming and whether I was ready for it, and decided, after about 20 minutes of honest reflection, that I probably was. Probably. The right of memory was Valith's choice for the third and final test, and when she announced it, the reaction in the chamber was different from the previous two announcements. The previous announcements had produced curiosity. This one produced something closer to concern. Several delegations began speaking at once. A Saloon representative pressed forward in its pressure suit. The Korathi cluster dimmed their section of the chamber lighting and then raised it again, which my research indicated was their equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Coordinator Peth set down every object in both hands and stood very still. Valith announced the test in the same level tone she had used for the others, and then she added a single sentence that the chamber system translated for everyone present. "This test will reveal what the human is, beyond biology and strategy." I sat with this for a moment. The right of memory was ancient, older than the conclave itself. It came from a tradition among the earliest spacefaring civilizations of using empathic readers, beings with natural neurological sensitivity to emotional states, to verify the character of individuals in positions of significant responsibility. The conclave had formalized it centuries ago as a test of what could not be simulated or measured, the actual interior experience of a person, their history, their genuine responses to what life had given them. It worked through contact. The Ithrani had a small cadre of trained readers within their delegation, individuals whose neurology was sensitive enough to receive emotional imprints from close proximity. The test was not a mind-reading exercise. It was not surveillance. It was closer to asking someone to show you their hands after a long life of work and reading what kind of work it had been. The catch was that the readings were verified by the conclave's independent empathic panel, which included readers from 3 different species, and the results were presented to the full assembly. Whatever they found would be seen by everyone. Valith had chosen this test, believing it would disqualify me. The logic was clear. The Ithrani had no record of humans as empathic beings. The conclave's biological registry listed human neurological architecture as sub-threshold for emotional resonance, meaning that human emotional responses were assumed to be primarily internal, not externally readable. The test had historically failed to produce verifiable results with species below a certain empathic output threshold. If I registered nothing, or below the minimum threshold, the test could not be completed. A test that could not be completed was a forfeit. I understood her thinking. I might even have made the same choice. It was tactically elegant. Choose a test that doesn't require defeating the opponent, just requires them to be something they're not. The preparation took an hour. The readers from the conclave panel introduced themselves. Two were Ithrani, both older, with a quiet quality about them that felt different from the deliberate stillness of Valeth's delegation. One was from a species I had not encountered before, small and still, with sensor organs above their eyes that oriented independently. The panel coordinator explained the process in careful, translated language. They would sit in proximity to me. They would attend to what arose. They would not try to interpret it or evaluate it. Their role was to receive, as accurately as possible, whatever was genuinely present in my emotional history and report that to the assembly. I nodded. They sat down around me. The room was quiet. The first reader reached out and placed a hand on my wrist. This was not required by the protocol, but it was apparently helpful, and I had said yes when asked. Her hand was cooler than I expected and very still. I did not try to present anything specific to them. This was the instruction. Let them receive what is there. Do not perform. I simply sat with my own history. I thought about my mother, who had worked night shifts at a hospital in Auckland for 22 years to pay for the education that had eventually brought me here. I thought about the first patient I lost as a medic, a young cargo pilot, and the specific texture of that afternoon, the waiting, the effort, and then the terrible stillness of the moment when the effort stopped mattering. I thought about a field hospital where I had worked for 14 months during a conflict, in a system that no longer had the political context to explain why it had started, and what it had felt like to be surrounded by people who were suffering in ways that medicine could address but not prevent. I thought about the morning after my first year in space medicine, sitting in a common room on a station, watching the sun rise over Earth's curve through the observation port and feeling, with a completeness that I had not expected, that I was glad to be alive, that the work was hard and the losses were real and the distances were enormous and I was glad. I thought about the people I had known who were no longer alive, and the specific way that grief works, not as something that ends but as something that changes shape over time, becoming part of the structure of a person rather than a weight they carry separately. I thought about why I had said yes to this assignment, not the official reasons, the real one. Because someone had to. Because Earth was 8 billion people who were curious and difficult and creative and stubborn, and capable of extraordinary things, and also capable of very poor decisions, and they deserved a voice in whatever galaxy they turned out to be living in. And because I had spent a career walking into rooms where things were going badly and trying to be useful, and this was just a larger version of the same room with higher stakes and a better thermos. I thought about home. Not as a concept, as a specific thing, the smell of rain on grass, the sound of a city waking up, the particular weight of an ordinary day when nothing exceptional happens and you are simply present in your own life, and that is enough. I sat with all of this. The first reader made a sound, low, not distressed, but something. The second reader moved slightly in their chair. The third reader, the small one with the independent sensor organs, turned both organs directly toward me and did not move them again for a long time. 7 minutes passed. Then 12. At the 15-minute mark, the first reader withdrew her hand from my wrist. She looked at the other two readers. A communication passed between them that I could not follow because it happened without language. Then the first reader looked at me. "We have what we need," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices get careful when the speaker is not sure what they are going to say next. The panel presented to the full assembly. I was not in the room for this part. I waited outside in a small antechamber with a chair and a table and a pitcher of water because my thermos was finally, genuinely empty and no one had found a way to refill it yet. The presentation took 40 minutes. I know what they said because Coordinator Peth came to find me at the end of it and read me a summary, slowly, in a tone that suggested the coordinator was still processing it personally. The readers had not found what Valeth expected them to find, which was absence, sub-threshold response, a biological system that didn't produce legible emotional output. They had found the opposite. Human emotional architecture, as directly experienced by 3 independent empathic readers, was not below threshold. It was above any threshold that existed in the conclave's measurement framework, not because human emotions were louder than other species, but because of the way they were structured, layered, not single events but accumulations. Not simple responses but complex textures made of many overlapping experiences, some old and faded, some recent and sharp, all coexisting simultaneously. The readers had not found a single worst moment, because human psychology does not file experience that way. They had found something more like a landscape, a terrain built from years of living in a world that demanded things and provided things in roughly equal measure, and the shape of a person who had moved through that terrain and was still moving. One reader had specifically noted, in the formal record, that the emotional experience of the human subject contained more discrete experiential layers than her instrument range was designed to measure, and that she had found herself, for the first time in 40 years of reader work, at the edge of her own capacity to process what she was receiving. She had not said this with alarm. She had said it with something that, when translated for the assembly, came through as reverence. The second reader had noted that the subject's relationship to loss was unlike any she had encountered. Not absence of grief, not suppression, something more structural, as if loss had been metabolized into the framework of the person rather than stored separately, and the person was still functioning, still directed, still finding meaning in what they did. The third reader had submitted a written notation rather than a verbal one. It read, "This is a species that has been suffering and persisting for longer than most of our civilizations have existed, and they have not stopped choosing to continue. I do not have adequate language for what I found. I am requesting access to Earth's full historical record." The right of memory produced a verifiable result. The test was complete. Under the rules of the trial of measure, a completed test could not be challenged. The third test had been run. It had produced a result. The result was formal. Valeth had chosen a test she believed would produce a forfeiture. Instead, it had produced what was now, officially, the most detailed empathic record of a human being in galactic history. I sat in the antechamber with the pitcher of water for another few minutes after Coordinator Peth finished reading me the summary. Then Valeth came to find me herself. She came alone, no advisors, no guards. She came through the antechamber door and stood across the small room from me, and her skin was a color I had now looked up. Pale green. Recalibration. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at me the way you look at something when you are updating a significant number of assumptions about it all at once, and the process is taking longer than expected. Then she said, in very careful translated language, "The readers told the assembly what they found." "I know," I said. "Peth told me." "They found that you carry very much," she said, "more than I would have thought a person could carry and remain functional." I thought about how to answer this. I thought about what the honest answer was. "We all carry more than we probably should," I said. "Humans are just stubborn about it." Valeth considered this. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked in the gravitational chamber after the first test, but the tone was different now. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a demand. It was an actual question. "Because there are always people worth going back to," I said. "At least, there always have been for me." Valeth's pale green skin deepened very slightly, not back to blue-gray, just deeper green. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "You were not in any of our threat models." "I know," I said. "We weren't in our own threat models until about 50 years ago. We're still catching up." "That is not reassuring," she said. "No," I agreed, "probably not." Something shifted in Valith's expression. It took me a moment to identify it because I was reading across a significant biological and cultural distance, but I thought, when I finally placed it, that it was the Ithrani version of reluctant acknowledgement. She left the antechamber without another word. She was not someone who apologized. That was not the Ithrani way. She did not acknowledge the challenge as a mistake, because in her cultural framework, a challenge was never a mistake. It was simply an engagement, and engagements produced outcomes, and outcomes were information. The information she had received from this engagement was significant. I drank a glass of water and thought about what came next. The formal ruling took place the following morning, and it was faster than I expected. 3 judges from the conclave's senior panel reviewed the trial of measure results. The review was a procedural requirement, not a genuine uncertainty. The results were documented, verified, and clear. All 3 tests had been completed. All 3 had produced results in my favor. The ruling was announced. Earth received full voting membership in the Galactic Conclave, effective immediately. The chamber processed this in various ways. The Korathi delegation pulsed their section, lighting 3 times in what I would later learn was their equivalent of formal acknowledgement. The Saloon representatives all oriented their suits in the same direction simultaneously. Several smaller delegations near the back of the upper tier were engaged in what appeared to be urgent communication with their home systems. Coordinator Peth, standing at the side of the chamber floor, caught my eye and gave a small nod. I signed the membership charter with the pen I had brought from home, a simple ballpoint pen, blue ink, that I had bought at a pharmacy in Wellington the week before I departed. Coordinator Peth's assistant asked if she could keep it after the signing. I gave it to her. I had a second one in my jacket pocket because I am a medic and we do not go anywhere without backup supplies. The charter was filed, the vote was recorded, the session was formally closed. Earth was a member. I sat in my chair for a while after the assembly began to disperse. I was not processing triumph. Triumph was not quite the right word for what was happening inside my head. It was something quieter, more like the feeling at the end of a very long shift, when you have done what you came to do and the rest of the world can take over for a while. 3 delegations approached me before I left the chamber, formally, with their designated diplomatic representatives, to express interest in beginning bilateral discussions with Earth. The first was a civilization called the Tavari, whose territory bordered a navigational corridor that would be significant for Earth's developing trade routes. The second was a research collective called the Meridian Synthesis, who had apparently been listening to the empathic panel's presentation very carefully and had specific questions about human neurological architecture that they wanted to explore through a formal research exchange. The third was Coordinator Peth, who handed me a document. It was a reclassification notice from the Conclave's registration system. Earth's classification had been updated. The old field read, Primitive, Protected, Non-Voting, Restricted. The new field read, Tier 0, Unclassified, Full Member. Below the tier designation was a footnote. The footnote explained that Tier 0 was a designation that had existed in the classification system since the Conclave's founding but had never been used, because the criteria for Tier 0 were by definition criteria that no existing model fully captured. The criteria, listed in small text, included demonstrated biological profiles outside existing measurement frameworks, demonstrated strategic depth exceeding current model parameters, demonstrated psychological architecture requiring new documentation categories. I read the footnote twice. Then I folded the document carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, next to the backup pen. The shuttle back to the Earth transit vessel was scheduled for early afternoon. I had a few hours. I spent them in a quiet section of the conclave station near the observation deck, where a wide, transparent panel looked out at the stars, and the asteroid's slow rotation brought a different quadrant of the sky into view every 40 minutes. I had my notebook. I started writing. Not notes on diplomacy, not strategy. I started writing the message I would send home when I reached the transit relay point, where the signal could be compressed and folded through the navigational network and reach Earth within 72 hours. It needed to be clear. It needed to be honest. It needed to explain something very large in words that would not frighten people before they had a chance to understand what it meant. I had been a medic for 16 years. A significant part of that work was explaining things to people in moments when they had not yet had time to prepare for the information. I knew how to do this. You didn't lead with the magnitude. You led with the fact. Then you gave the context. Then you let the magnitude arrive on its own because it always did, and it landed better when it wasn't announced. So I wrote, Earth is a full member of the Galactic Conclave as of this morning. There is more to explain, and I will explain all of it when I can. For now, we have a voice. The people who make decisions that affect inhabited star systems will hear that voice. We earned the seat. It is ours. I paused. Then I added, It is strange to sit in a room with beings from hundreds of civilizations and to feel, for the first time, that you are in the right place, that the work was the right work, that the long preparation and the difficult moments and the things that were harder than you expected all arrived at a morning when you signed your name to a document that said, This planet, these people, full members. I am going to sleep for approximately 3 days when I get home. I folded the notebook closed. Outside the observation window, the stars turned slowly past as the asteroid rotated. I could not pick out Earth's sun from this distance and angle. I knew roughly which direction it was in, but the specifics were beyond my navigation knowledge. Somewhere in that direction, 8 billion people were having their days. Ordinary days, most of them. Coffee in the morning. Work and difficulty and small satisfactions. Children learning things for the first time. Old people remembering things for the last time. People falling in love and falling out of it and finding their way back to something worth holding on to. None of them knew yet. In 72 hours they would. I thought about Valeth. She would be preparing her own report. I had no doubt about that. She was thorough and she was professional and she would file an accurate account of what had happened. And the Ithrani Empire's intelligence systems would begin the work of incorporating Earth into their models in a way that was significantly more complex than the previous classification. I was not worried about this. The Ithrani Empire was not going to do anything aggressive with the information in the short term. They had just watched a human sit in 4 times Ithrani standard gravity with a thermos and win a 1,400-year-old undefeated military simulation, and sit with 3 empathic readers for 15 minutes and come out the other side still discussing it calmly. Aggressive was probably not the first word they would reach for. There was a knock at the observation deck entrance. I turned. It was Valeth. She came in and stood a few feet away and looked out at the stars. She did not say anything immediately. I did not say anything either. We both looked at the same window and the same slowly moving sky. My Empire's files on Earth are 300 pages, she said finally. That's about 300 pages more than we have on the Ithrani Empire, I said. She paused. We have 11,000 pages, she said. You have been in space longer, I said. She was quiet again. My advisors have recommended reopening the bilateral agreement on the outer corridor, she said. Earth's position in the conclave makes the existing agreement structurally inefficient. I'll make a note, I said. Another pause. The reader's report is going to be read by every member of our military intelligence division, she said. Every educational institution, every governmental body above the regional level. I nodded. I had expected this. It will change how we think about humans, she said. Is that a problem? I asked. Valith looked at me directly. Before yesterday, she said, we thought humans were a curiosity, a young species with interesting biology and an unusually complicated history. The kind of civilization that typically either becomes something significant or collapses under the weight of its own development within 200 years. And now, I asked. Now, she said, we know that you have been carrying the weight of your own development for a very long time, and that you are still standing. I thought about what to say to this. We're stubborn, I said. It's one of our defining characteristics. Yes, she said. I have updated that assessment from a trivial biological note to a strategic classification. She turned to leave. She was halfway to the door when she stopped. The pen you used to sign the charter, she said, without turning around. The one you gave to the coordinator's assistant. Yes, I said. What was it made of? I thought about it. Plastic mostly, a little metal, a spring mechanism, blue ink made from a compound I couldn't name offhand. Nothing exceptional, she said. Nothing exceptional, I confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. You brought an ordinary pen, she said, to sign a document that will affect the governance of this sector of the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. I brought two, I said. The backup is still in my pocket. Valith made a sound. It was brief and low and in Ithrani, and my translation implant rendered it as a vocalization with no direct equivalent in the galactic standard language, though it was associated with situations where something was simultaneously entirely logical and completely unexpected. She left. I turned back to the observation window. The asteroid's rotation had brought a new section of sky into view. Somewhere in that direction, probably, was a star I couldn't name from here. And around that star, 8 billion people going about their days. I took out the notebook. I added one more line to the message. It turns out the galaxy is full of people who are very impressive and very capable, and have had a very long time to build their frameworks for understanding what a civilization is and what it can be. And then we showed up. I put the notebook away. I picked up my thermos and remembered again that it was empty. I walked down the corridor toward the shuttle bay, looking for someone who could point me toward the station's food service, because even on the most significant day in human diplomatic history, you still needed to eat something. And I had been running on coffee and adrenaline for 2 days, and it was, finally, time to stop. Humans are like that. We get the work done. And then we go find something to eat and call it a day.